You know how World War I always gets boiled down to that one gunshot in Sarajevo? Yeah, Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, alliances kick in, and suddenly, millions are dying in muddy trenches. But what if I told you the real trigger wasn't a bullet, it was a balance sheet? A handful of bankers huddled in smoke-filled rooms from London to New York, signing off loans worth billions in today's money, turned a regional conflict into humanity's bloodiest financial experiment. And here's the kicker. They financed both sides. Stick around because by the end, you'll see why your history books never told you this, and how their playbook still echoes through every modern war debt today. Let's rewind to 1914. Europe's a powder keg, nationalism is boiling, militaries are flexing. The assassination might have lit the fuse, but the real explosion came from the financial system behind it. Beneath the propaganda posters and patriotic speeches was something colder. A global money race, decades in the making. Empires were drowning in debt, their currencies chained to gold, and their ambitions funded not by kings, but by bankers. Picture this. Britain and France, the aging empires, sitting atop massive colonial networks in Africa and Asia, sucking in rubber, cotton, and oil to feed their factories. But beneath that empire shine, they were buried in debt. Years of imperial expansion had piled up staggering bills. Meanwhile, Germany, the ambitious newcomer, was late to the colonial party, desperate to grab its slice of Africa and the Middle East to fuel its steel mills and shipyards. Russia and Austria-Hungary, bloated, crumbling empires, were borrowing endlessly just to keep their fragile multi-ethnic states from falling apart. And behind them all, the true power brokers, the merchant banks of London, Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans, lending at rates that would make a loan shark blush. By 1914, the world economy was a delicate spiderweb tied to gold. Every major currency was backed by bullion, meaning one financial shock could drain a nation's reserves overnight. Trade wars and tariffs weren't just about pride or politics, they were about survival. When Britain blockaded German ships in the North Sea, that wasn't strategy. It was financial warfare, choking Berlin's exports, collapsing their banks. Here's the mindbender. These economic rivalries didn't just make war inevitable, they financed it. JP Morgan's $500 million lifeline to the Allies wasn't charity, it was investment. Meanwhile, Germany scrambled to strip gold from its own allies just to stay afloat. But the question remains, did these bankers know what they were unleashing, or was it just business as usual? Hold on, the receipts are wild, let's dig into the roots. Imperialism wasn't some noble quest for glory. It was a cash grab, pure and simple. By the late 1800s, Europe had carved Africa like a Thanksgiving turkey. Britain snatched Egypt and South Africa for cotton and gold. France dug deep into Indochina for rubber. Germany elbowed its way into Tanganyika and Namibia for phosphates. Why? Because factories across Manchester and Berlin were burning coal day and night, hungry for cheap resources to keep profits fat. Colonies meant labor that cost next to nothing, guaranteed markets for exports, and a steady stream of raw materials back to Europe. But here's the twist. Building empires isn't cheap. Railroads through jungles, forts across deserts, and wars against locals who refused to be conquered. All of it came with a price tag. And who paid for it? The governments, borrowing heavily from private banks. Britain, the empire where the sun never set, owed billions in bonds by 1900, much of it to those five titans of finance. The Rothschilds' empire stretched from Paris to Vienna. Barings had just survived their own South American debt fiasco. And across the Atlantic, JP Morgan was eyeing Europe like a banker with a new casino. These weren't state-backed loans. They were private deals secured by future colonial taxes, literally pledging the wealth of foreign lands before it was even extracted. France's push into North Africa left its bankers sweating over Ottoman-style debt systems that turned entire colonies into financial ATMs. Germany, meanwhile, was under the most pressure. Newly united in 1871, it was trying to play catch-up, building a navy to rival Britain's while its colonies barely paid for themselves. By 1913, Berlin's external debt had soared past 20 billion marks, funneled through the Reichsbank and private giants like Deutsche Bank. Russia was no better. Tsar Nicholas borrowed billions from French lenders to arm against the Ottomans, turning St. Petersburg into Paris's puppet. Sounds like a high-stakes game of Monopoly, but with real blood on the board. and the whole structure was swaying. Tariffs rose, trade wars brewed, Britain's splendid isolation policy squeezed German exports until Berlin's gold reserves started to evaporate. One bad harvest, one colonial uprising, and the system could have collapsed overnight. This wasn't just economics, it was paranoia. Kaiser Wilhelm II wasn't just afraid of encirclement, he was terrified of insolvency. If Britain strangled his trade routes, his empire would go broke. And the bankers, they thrived on the tension. Fear meant more loans meant more profit. By 1914, Europe's economy was a house of cards. And every king, emperor, and Kaiser owed their throne to the same handful of financiers. So how did all this debt and distrust spiral into total war? Enter the gold standard, the invisible handcuffs that turned rivalry into ruin. Now, the gold standard sounds dry, something you'd skip in an economics lecture. But this was the doomsday machine of early 20th century finance. Since the 1870s, every major power had pegged its currency to gold. 1 pound, 1 mark, 1 franc, all convertible to a fixed weight of bullion. It made global trade predictable, stable, until it didn't. Because gold is finite. When war, famine, or strikes disrupted mining or trade, gold drained from weaker economies, crashing their currencies overnight. By 1914, Britain hoarded nearly 40% of the world's bullion thanks to its colonial mines in South Africa and Australia. Germany's Reichsbank vaults, meanwhile, were running dry after years of naval expansion. Whenever tensions flared, like the 1911 Agadir crisis over Morocco, when France and Germany nearly went to war over phosphates, gold started to flee. Banks raised interest rates to lure it back, choking credit for everyone else. Farmers, factory owners, even bakers couldn't get loans. Imagine a Berlin baker denied credit because the Kaiser's navy drained the treasury. This wasn't abstract policy, it was survival. Unemployment soared, bread prices spiked, riots loomed, and the solution? More colonies, more gold mines, more debt. But the world had already run out of new frontiers, so nations turned on each other instead. And beneath it all, the alliances you read about, they weren't just political, they were financial contracts disguised as treaties. Bismarck's secret reinsurance treaty of 1887 promised neutrality with Russia unless France was involved. Kept under wraps to avoid spooking Austria, fast forward to the 1915 Treaty of London, Britain, France, and Russia literally bribed Italy with pieces of Austria and Albania to join their side. Secret clause, a $50 million loan plus shares in future war spoils. And don't even get me started on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where Britain and France carved up the Ottoman Empire like a pie, all hush-hush, already dividing oil fields before the first victory was won. These weren't acts of diplomacy, they were venture capital deals for destruction, banks underwriting the bonds of blood. Germany, locked out of this allied syndicate, turned inward. It began lending to Austria-Hungary, swallowing 71% of its debt by 1918 and stripping its gold reserves bare. It was parasitic finance, Berlin bankrolling Vienna's war machine while siphoning its bullion to plug its own leaking vaults. And this is where the emotion hits hardest. Millions marched off to die, believing in duty and honor. But the real war room wasn't in the trenches. It was behind the ledgers, with gold clerks in Frankfurt calling the shots. If you feel that righteous anger boiling, good, because we've hit the midpoint. And from here, the story twists even darker. One American banker stepped in with a loan so massive it didn't just fund the war. It forced a neutral giant to pick a side. What was it? And who had the power to pull that trigger? You won't believe the name. If this web of gold and greed is hitting you like it did me, showing how a handful of elites turned national rivalries into rivers of profit, do me a solid. Smash that like button if you're furious about these hidden hustles. Subscribe for more unfiltered history that schools never dared to teach. Turn on notifications too, because now we're cracking open the banker's playbook that rewired the entire 20th century. All right, cliffhanger payoff time. Enter JP Morgan Jr., the Wall Street titan who turned neutrality into a punchline. When war erupted in 1914, America was supposed to sit it out. President Wilson preached peace, and the public wasn't interested. But Morgan, he smelled the scent of profit in the smoke of Europe's battlefields. From day one, his firm became the Allies' personal supplier. $3 billion in munitions, food, and steel funneled through JP Morgan and Company. That's the equivalent of more than $80 billion today. Then came the deal that changed everything. A $500 million loan to Britain and France in 1915. the biggest foreign bond issue in history. The Rothschilds chipped in from London, wiring funds to keep Paris alive. Why risk so much? Because neutrality didn't pay. Morgan's partners knew that if Germany won, the Allies would default, and their empire would crumble. By 1916, Britain was footing the bill for nearly every front. Italy's entire war budget, two-thirds of France and Russia's gold reserves drained, overseas assets pawned, private credit stretched to the breaking point. Enter Uncle Sam. Morgan lobbied Wilson relentlessly, whispering that if the Allies fell, U.S. exports would collapse and the economy would crash. Years later, the Nye Committee exposed how deep that pressure went. Those private loans tied America's hands, making Allied defeat unthinkable. If Britain or France defaulted, Wall Street would implode. So in 1917, American soldiers shipped out, not only to make the world safe for democracy, but to protect Morgan's balance sheet. Germany tried to counter by forging secret gold pacts with the Ottomans, sending 3.5 billion marks in credit to keep Vienna afloat. But it backfired. The Reichsbank printed notes like wildfire, inflation soared, and the mark began to die. Meanwhile, central banks everywhere, including the brand new Federal Reserve, born in 1913, suspended gold convertibility and printed paper money without restraint. The rules of sound finance were gone. Only one rule remained: debt is the new weapon. The total cost of the war, $28 billion. Taxes covered almost nothing. The rest came from war bonds, sold on patriotism, bought by grandmothers and school children. But who cashed in? The houses of Morgan and Rothschild pocketed massive commissions from every shipment, every contract, every bond sold, while trenches filled with the poor, boardrooms toasted victory loans. It's gut-wrenching. Letters from the front spoke of mud, frostbite, and brothers lost. Back home, champagne glasses clinked over rising profits. 16 million dead, empires shattered. Yet the financial web, stronger than ever. The U.S. emerged as the new global creditor. London was dethroned, but still scheming. And none of this was coincidence. It was design. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the ledgers didn't balance. They broke the world. Versailles wasn't peace. It was a debt trap. Reparations chaining Germany to economic ruin and hyperinflation, paving the road straight to Hitler's rise. They say a gunshot in Sarajevo started the war. But the real battle was fought in vaults, where gold trumped glory and loans outlasted lives. We've romanticized the trenches. But the real horror wasn't out there. It was in the spreadsheets. Ordinary men, your great-grandfather maybe, sacrificed for numbers written in ink. The so-called war to end all wars didn't end anything. It birthed modern finance. The Rothschilds and Morgans didn't pull triggers, but their pens redrew the map of misery, and the echo still rings. You can see it today in every sanctions list, every IMF bailout, every reconstruction loan dressed as salvation. If this flipped how you see history, drop a comment. What's the shadiest financial move you've spotted in modern conflicts? Subscribe, because the past still lives in the present. Stay curious, stay skeptical. History didn't end, it was underwritten.